Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first lecture for Introduction to Philosophy. Um, During this presentation, I'm going to be introducing you to some of the larger um, ideas within this discipline known as philosophy, and then we will dive into some of the details of the book, The Apology, which I've asked you to read. I am just going to pull up a PowerPoint in order to walk you through some of the basics here. um, Philosophy. Perhaps you've heard something about, but if you're new to the topic, hopefully this will give you a little orientation. Um, in addition to covering sort of the background and a little bit of the history of what philosophy is about, I'd like to get into the life and work of Plato and Socrates, the main figures that we'll be covering for our unit on ancient Greek philosophy. And then we will introduce ourselves to the Apology, this sort of difficult book that kicks off the five dialogues of Plato. Okay, so just in terms of the history of philosophy, it's a very complicated and very long history. But as far as we're aware, Western philosophy as we know it begins during the 5th century before the current era in what is contemporary Turkey. There was no Turkey at this time, but as far as we know, the very first philosophy was practiced in what is present day Turkey. Um, Philosophy is famous for being the very first intellectual discipline in the West. It seems to be kind of the most broad and most fundamental, and it gives birth to a number of other disciplines like mathematics, uh, it could be argued science. So it's a very foundational kind of approach to knowledge. Philosophers, it's often said, are interested in the big picture, whereas particular disciplines like history, poetry, social science focus on um, more detailed areas of life. Philosophy is kind of interested in everything, so it can be a little bit overwhelming in terms of just the scale and the breadth with which philosophers have historically taken up questions, and is a very question-oriented approach to knowledge. Um, who is the first philosopher? There's actually a lot of debate about this, but as far as most historians are concerned, it is a fellow named Thales, who it's probably pretty sketchy, the actual details of his life, but Thales lived roughly in 585 BCE. Um, and Thales, it's often remarked, begins philosophy almost by accident. He did not have any particular intention of sitting down and kind of having a moment of, aha, I'm going to invent philosophy. What happened was he was a very curious person, and the story goes that he was apparently walking around one night contemplating the stars and the cosmos. And many philosophers at this time were obsessed with cosmology, as we would call it. But Thales famous, famously absent-minded, trips and he falls into a well containing water. He has kind of a eureka moment from tripping into water, it is said, and he comes up with this theory that really all of reality is water. That if you kind of boil everything down to its fundamentals, what you find in reality is water. Uh, so this is kind of sometimes noted as the very first philosophical claim or philosophical position. Um, and probably a number of you are possibly not very impressed. Seems to be obviously a false claim. But what made it special, as against other observations of his time, was that he was interested in everything. He was interested in what everything was made of. And that's really how philosophy begins. So philosophy begins in contemplation. It begins in a very kind of speculative mode. Philosophers historically have been absent-minded people interested in just thinking about reality, why there is something rather than nothing, and what it really means. So Thales kind of kicks off this tradition. Um, so Thales, his whole kind of argument caught on. In a way, he triggered a sort of a chain reaction of other thinkers who wanted to do him one better and come up with a better answer to what reality was really made of. So a whole number of people came following in his footsteps. We have a fellow named Anaximander who said, you know what, Thales, everything's not really water. Everything is actually air. If you look around in the sky, it's kind of a ton of air out there. So I think this is a more accurate argument. We then have a guy named Anaximander, a very important mathematician as well as philosopher, who argued that everything is actually infinite, that the real nature of reality is that it goes on forever. And the Greeks have a very complicated history to the concept of infinity. Many of them were very terrified of the idea of infinity and saw it as a kind of chaotic interpretation of the world. But Anaximander was famous for saying, no, reality must be infinite, in fact. Heraclitus comes along, and Heraclitus is unique in this bunch because he's actually one of the few from this time period who has writings that we survive. Heraclitus's fragments are very, very wonderful and beautiful collection of writings. But Heraclitus is actually famous for saying that you cannot step into the same river twice, and that is because everything is change, everything is transformation. So Heraclitus introduced a way of doing philosophy which saw the universe as in perpetual flux, in perpetual conflict and transformation. We then have a fellow named Anaxagoras, who says that everything is actually number. If you look at nature closely enough and kind of strip away all of the details, what's really left there is just number, a kind of ordered system. And this is actually a profoundly modern idea, which many physicists today will ultimately adhere to, the idea that nature can be kind of interpreted mathematically. We actually find in Anaxagoras. So those are just some of the early, what are called pre-Socratic philosophers who come before Socrates and come before Plato, and they kind of set the put philosophy on the map as a way of thinking about the world. Very quickly, philosophy and different philosophers began to carve up the discipline into different subjects or different areas. They're overlapping, but gradually different distinct topics started to come up. The first topic, a word maybe you've heard, is metaphysics. Metaphysics probably is the dominant subject within philosophy. All those pre-Socratic thinkers we were just mentioning are really metaphysicians. Metaphysics is interested in the nature of reality in the most fundamental sense. It is trying to get at what is underlying the appearance of things and trying to get at the fundamental materials or entities or principles that make up our world. So metaphysics, in a way, I like to think of it simply as a precursor to science as we understand it, in that it is interested in how the world actually works. What are the laws or principles that underline and govern nature? So the word meta actually in Greek just means after or beyond, and physics just means nature. So to do metaphysics means you are interested in what is after nature or what is deeper than nature. A big word, we'll see this word occasionally as we read Plato, essence. Metaphysicians very interested in essences or substances, things that are underlying the appearance of entities. Okay, so metaphysics obviously is very prone to speculation and kind of thinking about the big picture. Epistemology is another very important branch of philosophy, and epistemology is specifically concerned with the nature of knowledge, what I as a human being can actually know about not only the world, but about myself. So epistemology tends to be interested in the meaning of truth, the meaning of language, how I can actually prove that what I think is true is in fact true, right? That when I make a claim about reality, it actually connects up with reality in some objective way. So in the Greek, episteme, the word simply means knowledge, and any of these ology terms comes from the Greek logos, which simply means science. So biology, for instance, that means the study of life. Bios just means life in Greek. Anthropology means the study of humanity. Right, so all of these are coming out of the Greek tradition. Epistemology is also interested in the nature of mind in general. We will get a little bit of this kind of questioning in Plato, particularly as we read the Phaedo, but philosophers have been totally obsessed with what mind ultimately is and how it works. Political philosophy, another very big branch of philosophy, of course, interested in the nature of society and what kind of society would actually be best. Socrates, we will see, is a very political philosopher, very interested in the question of what makes society just. A related question in political philosophy is what is human nature? This will be an important concept in our class in particular. The connection between human nature and politics has to do with trying to imagine what kind of society connects up best with what is natural to humanity or not natural. So we will see as we read people like Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau that philosophers are very interested in humanity and its underlying nature in order to think about what best society would best be adequate to that nature. And finally, justice. Plato in particular is very concerned with what justice means. Can there be a just social structure or just social order, or are we kind of left to living in a world that, more often than not, of course, seems to be lacking in justice? But what is the meaning of justice? What do we say? What do we mean when we say that an act is just? That's a big political topic. We also have the domain of ethics, which is quite related to political philosophy, and perhaps some of you will take a whole class on ethics as you go on. But ethics is really interested in the right kind of life. What would be the best, the most virtuous kind of life? We will see Socrates maybe thinks this is the most important question. So ethics has to do with action, with practice, not just with contemplation. What is the nature of good and evil? You'll probably be able to guess that this can become a religious question. It can become a theological question. But philosophers historically have been also very interested in humanity as something that seems to vacillate between the extremes of good and evil. And then to return to the question of human nature, it is often argued whether or not humanity is ultimately good or ultimately evil. So that will be a topic we will return to together. So those are just some of the big topics or branches of philosophy. There are many more, but those are among the most important ones. So just to get into some more individuals, we talked about the pre-Socratics, but if you've heard of anyone in philosophy, you have heard of Plato. The most famous philosopher in the Western tradition by far is Plato. He seems to be the first one to write in a very all-encompassing way, in a very systematic way. Plato writes about literally everything, every single topic: love, friendship, community, justice, the afterlife, God, creation, you name it. Plato has a dialogue about it. So that's really what his importance lies in. Just to give you a little sense for who the man was, we think he lived from 424 to 383 BCE. He was a little bit taller, a little bit older than Socrates, or excuse me, a little bit younger and learned all of his tricks, as it were, from Socrates. Um, Plato is the first philosopher we know of who wrote down his ideas systematically. He seemed to be very concerned with transcribing all of his friends and mentors' conversations. So you'll notice when we read that a lot of Plato takes the form of a dialogue. It seems to be almost a play. And we'll talk about the importance of that, but Plato believed it was very important that philosophy should be a kind of a back and forth between interlocutors, between friends. And so Platonic philosophy is very much revolutionary for having seen philosophy not just something that takes place in an individual's mind, but between people. And in terms of that communal spirit, philosophy also begins as a collective enterprise when Plato founds what we believe to be the very first kind of university, the Academy of Athens. This is the first time that people in a very orderly way gather to study and learn philosophy. You can see here there's the painting from Raphael, which depicts Plato and Aristotle, the major philosophers of their time, and surrounding students. So Plato kind of institutionalizes philosophy in the first real way. So probably from your readings, you're wondering the relationship exactly between Socrates and Plato. Socrates is really the main character of the dialogues we are reading. And Socrates was Plato's teacher, who was a teacher to many. And Socrates, a bit older than Plato, lives from 469 to 399 BCE. And he is famous for, in a sense, popularizing philosophy as a method of dialogue and a method of debate in Athens. And just as another detail, Greece was not the nation or country that we know it to be. It was really just different city-states, Athens being probably the most kind of central city-state for philosophy and political life. And Socrates becomes something of a famous, some would say infamous figure as he starts to spread the method of philosophy to a growing circle of students. Plato has a lot of things to say about Socrates and gives us a lot of reasons as to why he believes he is such an important thinker. Plato, it is said, regarded Socrates as the wisest man in Athens and the most complete human being he ever knew. We will try to think together about why this is the case as we work through the Apology. But what Plato most admired about Socrates is that he devoted his entire life to philosophy. He had no money, which is a common attribute of philosophers. He seemed to be almost a homeless person, living in rags. He was a kind of ugly man, it is often said, but he didn't care. He was completely in love with philosophy and completely in love with this way of life. Now, in terms of the ideas and the methods that Socrates innovated, what he's probably most famous for is this method called the Socratic Method, named after him, of course. We'll try to see how this actually works when we look at the details of the book. But what the Socratic Method entailed was a skeptical approach to philosophy. In other words, unlike the pre-Socratics, the guys like Anaximander and Thales, who were simply kind of spouting off ideas about what nature was, Socrates believed that true wisdom had to begin in a kind of recognition of one's own limits, that one's own understanding of the world might be severely flawed. And we'll see that that's his beginning position as we work through the Apology. So Socrates becomes very, very infamous, but he also starts to become something of an enemy to the Athenian political state for a number of reasons. They are not at all amused with his growing influence, and we'll try to figure out why that's so. Okay, apologies for that little disruption. Just to pick this up, um, Socrates becomes kind of a political enemy of sorts, and you'll notice at the Apology that he's actually under arrest and he's actually being tried for various crimes. So you might be asking the question. We'll have to return to this: why philosophy or thinking about reality is such a threat to political leaders, but indeed they find it to be worthy of some kind of punishment. Um, so just to get into the details of the Apology, those are just some of the background kind of contextual issues on philosophy and Plato in general. Let's take a look here at the Apology, where I think we can actually begin to see Socrates in action. Um, so the Apology, and by the way, all of these dialogues are written by Plato. Socrates famously never wrote a word, but Plato luckily was very devoted to his mentor and very devoted to transcribing all of the dialogues he had. So probably it's not a complete picture, but it's a reasonably complete picture of every conversation Socrates ever had. So this is also known as the Apology of Socrates. You're probably wondering from reading this text where the actual apology comes from. Socrates doesn't appear to be particularly apologetic, and really this is just a translation from the Latin apologia, which just simply means defense. So actually a better or more accurate title to the dialogue would be the defense of Socrates. I think that's really what this dialogue is presenting. We think the dialogue was written in 399 BCE, so it's referred to as an early dialogue of Plato's. And it is Socrates' self-defense, as I say. And actually here, which is somewhat unusual, Socrates does most of the talking. He is in a way acting like his own lawyer in a criminal trial against a man named Miletus, who has been hired by the state to prosecute him. So the first kind of issue is, what is Socrates accused of? What is his actual crime? There's a number of different accusations being hurled his way. Socrates famously says, "I am boxing with shadows." In other words, there's something hard to pin down about his accusations. It's not very well defined. There might even be multiple accusations, right? The first and most famous accusation is that Socrates is accused of corrupting the youth. In other words, there's something about his philosophical practice that is polluting the minds of his students, or I don't know, maybe making them evil or somehow rebellious. So that's really the first suspicion. And then we're also going to get a more theological or religious accusation, and it's going to be an accusation of impiety, maybe atheism. It's a little unclear at times what exactly his impiety is about. We'll try to address those details, but bear in mind on the impiety issue that we're operating within the context of the Greek mythology of gods, a whole kind of hierarchy of gods. And Socrates has a possibly unusual or perhaps blasphemous relationship to those gods that are meant to be taken very seriously and in a very orthodox fashion. So what are some of the elements of the text? Why is this such an important Platonic dialogue? As I mentioned before, Plato is famous for revolutionizing the structure of a dialogue text. In other words, philosophy really operates best, according to Socrates, as a dialogue, as a kind of a debate or a dialectic, as it's sometimes referred to, as a back and forth between an advocate for a point of view and a opponent of that point of view. So Socrates is accused by Miletus, as I say, who is in a way a kind of a statesman or a kind of an attorney. But we get the sense, maybe you'll notice in the book, that he might be just really kind of an agent for Anytus, a more powerful person in Athens. And the text is fascinating for its combination of different details from ancient Greek society. It's often talked about as a great, albeit very brief and condensed window onto Athenian life. We get a combination of mythology, religion, and a combination combined with politics as well as philosophy. So it's a great way to start philosophy because we get a little bit of a sense for the world that Plato was operating in. So this is Socrates' defense, and he begins right away with a very long kind of defense of who he is and what his method and approach to philosophy is. As I say before, apologia means defense. Really, Socrates, we will see, does not take back anything that he's ever done in his life. In a way, part of what's challenging about the book is it's looking retrospectively at a life we assume is already pretty well complete. He's very old at this point, and he is too committed to his own method now to take anything back. So Socrates is not sorry for anything. He does not believe he has corrupted anyone. He does not believe that he has done anything wrong. Okay, so we're going to have to see exactly whether or not the charges stand up. So what did he do wrong, or what is he meant to do wrong? We have two charges. They are referred to in the text as older charges and newer charges. The older ones are murkier and they kind of seem like almost like gossip or rumors. And then there are newer ones, which are maybe a little more defined. We get a quote here on page 24 that is the first indication of what is specifically being launched at him. Socrates is guilty of wrongdoing in that he busies himself studying things in the sky and below the earth. He makes the worse into the stronger argument, and he teaches the same thing to others. There's actually a couple different things here. The first, he makes the worse argument into the stronger one. We're going to have to think about what that means. And he apparently busies himself studying things in the sky and below the earth. That sounds relatively harmless, but perhaps to these guys running the state, that might be blasphemous. So it could be said, and it's the indication here, is that Socrates does not believe in the traditional Greek gods. Maybe he is inventing his own gods. Maybe he's teaching his students to not believe in God at all. All those things are a little obscure and a little opaque, but we get the feeling that Socrates is a bit of a rebel when it comes to traditional Greek orthodoxy. All right. Now, whether or not Socrates believes in God at all is kind of a contentious issue. I think there is evidence that he does believe in the gods, but perhaps he has a unique relationship to them. So I ask that to you as an honest question. What is his theological position? We'll see him refer to his daimon or his daemon, which is a kind of spirit guardian, which apparently he believes in. So if he believes in that guardian, there is some notion of the divine at work in Socrates, although maybe it's kind of heterodox. Really what I think is the overriding claim in the idea that he turns the worse argument into the stronger one is that he's accused of being a teacher. Now you might ask what is possibly wrong with being a teacher. Well, it might be that he manipulates or deceives his students into believing falsehoods. That is kind of, I think, the worry that he is posing to Greek society. He might, in effect, kind of have a difficult position to overcome in that those charges which are older might prejudice the jury against him. In other words, as he says, I'm boxing against shadows. These kind of epithets have been stuck to me my entire life, and there's no way. We get the sense from Socrates, a sense of defeatism, that he won't be able to overcome that suspicion. So now I'd like to just actually take a quick look at the text so that we can have Socrates in his own words. He describes these things better than I do. If you look just at the beginning of 22, it begins right away with a very famous speech from Socrates. He dives right in to the issue. And here Socrates says, I do not know, men of Athens, how my accusers affected you. As for me, I was almost carried away in spite of myself. So persuasively did they speak, and yet hardly anything of what they said is true. Of the many lies they told, one in particular surprised me, namely, that you should be careful not to be deceived by an accomplished speaker like me, that they were not ashamed to be immediately proved wrong by the facts when I show myself to be an accomplished speaker at all, that I thought was most shameless on their part. Unless, indeed, they call an accomplished speaker the man who speaks the truth. Um, if they mean that I would agree that I am an orator, but not after their manner. For indeed, as I say, practically nothing they said was true. From me, you will hear the whole truth, though not by Zeus, gentlemen, expressed in embroidered and stylized phrases like theirs, but things spoken at random and expressed in the first words that come to mind. For I put my trust in the justice of what I say, and let none of you expect anything else. It would not be fitting at my age, as it might be for a young man, to toy with words when I appear before you. So here Socrates, I think, is actually compressing a number of issues at stake, both in his accusation and in his own approach to philosophy. He seems to be very concerned with the manner in which he's presenting his position. He is adamant that he is not kind of glorifying his position with stylized phrases and fancy language. I ask you to kind of think for yourself whether or not this is true. He seems to be pretty eloquent and pretty articulate, but he believes to be speaking simply, straightforwardly, and therefore in a truthful way. So what's the relationship between truth and the manner in which it is conveyed? That is a big kind of debate, I think, that is live and well in this dialogue. Socrates seems to be under pressure for maybe twisting the truth through his intelligence, maybe bending the truth with fancy language or expressions that are difficult to unpack. Here, Socrates is saying, on the contrary, what you see is what you get. I'm only interested in the truth. So he is staking his claim as a philosopher in that he is someone interested in the truth and the truth alone. All right. So just to return here to this issue of teaching and the prejudices associated with it, Socrates, in effect, is accused of being a sophist. Now, just to give you a little bit of a kind of word on what sophistry was, sophistry was, in effect, a class of professional teachers in ancient Greek society. We don't really have anything equivalent to them. They were essentially people you would hire if you were a rich man headed for a life in politics. And what sophists were experts in, and you'll get some references to them in the book, is rhetoric. They taught you the art of rhetoric, which was very important to public life. So what is rhetoric? Rhetoric, maybe you've heard in certain contexts, is essentially the art of persuasion, and is the art of using language to convey and win over a particular point of view. And Socrates in particular is interested in the emotional pull of rhetoric. You'll notice that some language and some kinds of arguments really tug on your heartstrings more than others. Some use emotion to try to persuade you. You know, probably this is no surprise to you, but politicians are very much well equipped with rhetoric in that they will appeal to emotion first as a way to win voters. So I ask you, is this a good thing or a bad thing to use rhetoric? Right now, there isn't really a position one way or the other, but Socrates is careful to point out that what he is doing is not mere rhetoric. He is not going to use emotion to make his case. So something is very important for him in terms of this position as being a sophist or not. So the debate is really a matter in the apology of whether or not Socrates is a sophist. He insists that he is not. He is doing something different from sophistry. He is not simply interested in persuading for the sake of winning a debate with an opponent. He's interested in something else. Okay, so let's just continue. Here, we can return to the text in a moment, but what is he interested in doing if not simply persuading? You'll notice there's kind of complexity built into the text here, in that Socrates has to persuade the jury in the trial that he is not a persuader. So you see, there's something kind of doomed for him from the start, because in order to win his argument, probably he will have to rely on at least some rhetoric. However, he is very careful to note that the rhetoric he's using is not manipulative, right? It is not deceptive. What is the strategy he uses? We'll have to see what it is. I think that really Socrates is just drawing a distinction between rhetoric and philosophy. Rhetoric is only interested in winning. It is only interested in persuading. So a politician might try to win over voters to a particular point of view, even if he or she does not believe in that point of view. So a rhetorician, it's said here, doesn't really have any interest in the truth of the matter. Such a person's only interested in winning. Socrates is adamant that philosophy is better and it's different than that, because it's only interested in the truth, and it views arguments and kind of rational discussion as the means by which we arrive at the truth. So some people respond to Socrates a little negatively. He seems arrogant and maybe a little cocky with his intelligence, but I believe there's a great humility in Socrates, and I think that's part of what attracted Plato to Socrates. He was really truly interested in the truth of the matter, no matter what it was he was investigating. And so he's really staking a claim here as to what philosophy is about. Philosophy is about the truth. He believes that there is a real world out there, and philosophy has something to do with discovering the truth of reality. So Socrates is, it's often said, misidentified, mislabeled as a mere sophist. And the reason he's misidentified as a sophist is because of his Socratic method. So what is the Socratic method? You'll encounter it in different contexts. If you go to law school, perhaps you'll be trained in the art of Socratic reasoning. But what it really is a way of discovering the truth through questioning, through a kind of critical interrogation of one's assumptions about life and about reality. So Socrates is famous for revolutionizing philosophy as something that begins in skepticism. By skepticism, we simply mean a willingness to recognize the limits of one's own knowledge. He argues that most of the opinions we have about life are really just prejudices or things that have been passed down to us by our parents, or through school, or through our culture. And that philosophy has to kind of strip away all of those prejudices through a kind of rigorous interrogation of our fundamental assumptions. So the method proceeds with a kind of unknowingness or a willful or recognized ignorance that he believes to be the correct starting point for a true investigation, no matter what the topic. Okay, so aspects of the method, I would say, and you'll see the method recur both in this dialogue, but also in the allegory of the cave and the Phaedo. It assumes the ignorance of the participants. In other words, you have to assume that really you're wrong when it comes to a big topic like the nature of justice or the nature of truth or the nature of goodness or evil. So rather than, in a sense, advocating for a point of view, it's a kind of negative procedure, right? You begin with nothing and you try to build up some certain principles that can sketch out a definition. And also it proceeds with questioning rather than just simply positing answers to things. Socrates, you'll notice, not so much in the Apology, but elsewhere, really is more interested in teasing out the assumptions of his opponent. He will, in a very maybe annoying way, question you to reconsider things that you hold to be true and to see whether or not they actually withhold a certain amount of scrutiny, right? So often he will simply tease out things that you think you know, but really when you try to define or explain, you actually can't do very well. And if you can get to a kind of collision with that inadequacy in your own point of view, maybe you can actually correct yourself and come to a more adequate point of view. The method's also totally obsessed with definitions. Many of Plato's dialogues with Socrates begin with a question: what is piety? What is justice? What is beauty? And His opponent will give a definition. Socrates will ask him to clarify that definition. The definition will be revealed to show some limit or something inadequate. And then the definition will have to be refined and improved. So it's very interested in what we mean when we say certain things, or what we actually, whether or not we can actually put names and designators to ideas in our mind. Okay, so we'll see Socrates totally obsessed with terminology and with language. And finally, and maybe most importantly, the method that Socrates revolutionized is obsessed with logic and with logical contradictions. If he shows that you have a logical error or a logical fallacy, it means that there is something mistaken in your point of view and it needs rendering. So just to follow up on this, what is a contradiction? Probably you've heard the word and used it in a certain context. In philosophy, it really refers to a statement that has two opposing positions within it implicitly. And it's really a kind of matter of logical investigation to show that, in a certain sense, a contradiction cannot be true in the sense that the reality it refers to can't possibly be, right? So a contradiction is, by logicians, referred to as a logical fallacy. It somehow breaks the laws of logical validity. And when you end up saying something contradictory, you, in a sense, show your cards as someone who has a mistaken position on the nature under investigation. We'll see examples of logical contradictions as we work through the details of the book. So I would say the Socratic method is Socrates' key revolutionary kind of tool. It's the main tool in his toolbox. And I think it gives us a complete picture of what he thinks philosophy is about. Philosophy for Socrates is a search for the truth. It is about rationality and logic, not just emotion and kind of conventional values that maybe we've inherited. And it's also about arguments. Argumentation is crucial for Socrates. If you can't kind of prove the soundness and validity of the point of view you're advocating, it should not be followed. So he really wanted his students to not follow particular opinions he had, but to follow this method, to use it as a critical kind of vehicle for arriving at your own truth, your own position on the world. And it's this kind of strange skepticism that bothered or was kind of irritating to political authority. And I'm kind of asking you to think about why it might be something that is regarded as threatening by politics and by political authority. One other thing that is important, I think, in Socrates' approach is the falsification of opinion. Philosophy is often conflated with opinion. You might hear the expression, well, my personal philosophy is this, right? Really what you're saying is my personal opinion is this. Socrates' approach is actually one that holds a very pretty strong border between mere opinion and truth. Truth, it is often revealed, is something that actually is very, very different from your personal opinion. Opinions are kind of subjective and arbitrary. They're usually just value statements about your preferences. Truth is something a little bit more binding, and often a critical investigation of one's opinions reveals that often they're really lacking in something. Okay, so we'll see that Socrates is interested in teasing out what is wrong-headed about our common sense opinions on a whole range of issues. Things like beauty, things like friendship, things like a life worth living. He's interested in showing that opinions are often false. Okay. So here's your guided read question just for our in-person meeting. I mentioned this before, but this will appear on the discussion thread. Does Socrates' method, that is the method of skepticism, mean that his accusers are right? In other words, is he actually guilty of corrupting the youth of anything? And if so, what? Now, it might seem kind of obvious, or like that, because he's kind of a hero of history of some sort, that he must be innocent, but it's not actually clear to me that he is innocent of any of the charges that are raised. Okay. So is he guilty of anything? Has he corrupted some minds with this method? Is there anything destabilizing about the approach that he's introduced to his students? So I ask you to just kind of formulate your opinion as we work through the arguments in his defense, and we will talk about how he tries to prove his innocence when we meet in person. Okay, take care.